Welcome to the Library Podcast for Pride. I'm John Barbrook, Faculty Librarian for Science and Technology, Health and Medicine. I would like to express a warm welcome to Dr. Rianna Price, who is the Project Coordinator for Ethics, Values and Policy Initiative. We're here to talk about resources and databases that are useful for LGBTQ+ searching in the library. And also hear from Rianna about her very interesting research and how she uses resources in her research. A short warning in advance, part of what we'll discuss in this podcast is the impact that discriminatory terminology and outdated language might have on research. So we may use less acceptable and even discriminatory words as part of our discussion. So the warning out of the way, let's just dive right in and talk to Rianna, whose focus is on research in the queer medicalisation in India.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much for having me on this. I'm very looking forward to talking to you about my research. So just to kind of pick up on my topic, queer medicalisation, first of all, queer as a term can be viewed by some, especially in older generations, as a derogatory term, right? And there are three reasons that I use queer in my research. First of all, it's elasticity as a term. So the reason that we use queer is because it's very expansive and it covers experiences from everybody in the LGBTQ+ community, right? So you can think about it in a more nuanced way if you think about queerness rather than trying to categorise people exactly into L or B or G or whatever. And second of all, the other reason I use queer as a term is because it's very enshrined in academic discourse. It's one of those things where for the last 20, 30 years, academics have been thinking about querying, however you want to talk about it, heteronormative ideals, to think about them in more depth and to think about them from different perspectives. And last but not least, the other reason I use queer is because as a term it has been reclaimed by the community, and I know that especially the younger generations use it as a more general term to kind of describe their experience. So just getting that out of the way, because I always have to do this for my research, but queer is what I will be using throughout the podcast. So apologies if you find that offensive, but that's kind of how we use it. My research is about the medicalisation of queerness, which is thinking about how psychiatric practitioners would think of queerness as a medical disorder in India. And the reason that this is very interesting and very relevant to the kind of new library resources is because what I'm dealing with is a marginalised community within the Global South, which means that for my PhD, which I started in 2019, I had issues accessing resources for my particular project, not helped by COVID in 2020, meaning I couldn't get out to India. But basically that a lot of the things that I was looking at, because queerness was criminalised until 2018, meant that, dealing with it in the Indian context was quite difficult, right? And I didn't want to just think about medicalisation from a European perspective, move it over to India and plop it down and say this is exactly the same. I wanted to think about Indian culture, religion and politics, as well as the legal and medical stuff, to think about how it works in the Indian context rather than just assuming that it's the same as the UK and the US. So that's broadly what my research did.
That's fantastic, super. So, obviously we're here to talk about our resources and what you used for the resources. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to make you feel bad if you have things now which you don't have access to or didn't have access to when you do your research. So hopefully you'll use them in the future. Yes. So what kind of resources did you use in your research? What was commonly discovered by you?
Yeah, so obviously there was psychiatric literature and journals which I accessed through websites within India themselves. So it was a lot of online research because they didn't, obviously it's not the kind of like BMJ or the Lancet, which we have access to. It's very specialised Indian specific journals. I also used a lot of queer magazines, film resources, policy documents and citizens' reports from like NGOs to think about the ways in which queerness is both, medicalised queerness is both expressed and resisted from like a queer-centred approach, so thinking about how the community themselves thought about their own medicalisation and pushed back or accepted it. That was the main resources I used were actually from activists within India who gave me access to their personal collections, their personal archives of like queer materials. And also, before the library got Gale access, I was actually one of the kind of people who runs the sexuality archive for Gale got in touch with me and asked me to help decolonise their resources and gave me access to Gale to help with my research as well. So, you know, it was a lot of personal networking that got me some resources, but yeah, it was difficult.
It sounds very much like grey literature was a key part of your research. You mentioned about the decriminalisation. Would you say that the legal status in India was a big issue for you getting good quality research materials?
Yes, definitely, because it meant that, first of all, anything that was to do with same-sex eroticism could be penalised by law. So, for example, if you were a NGO that was distributing condoms to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS, you could be prosecuted under 377 for the promotion of homosexuality. So those sorts of incidents that occurred within the legal and medical spheres meant that people were less engaged with queerness as a term, and it became very underground and became like very marginalised as an experience in India.
Super, so that's really interesting. And this is really interesting because it's also can tie back into one of the things we do here now at Lancaster, which is much more prominent, and that's decolonising. And something the library did, which was looking at our content and our resources within the context of decolonising. We have a little project, we have decolonising literature searching, we have some guidance, which we'll link to in the comments below. But a little bit of a background is, around about 3 years ago, we discovered that actually some of our resources were not as comprehensive as we hoped. We were seeing a lot more systematic reviews. Over COVID, the numbers of systematic reviews we were seeing had significantly increased. However, some of the researchers, usually researchers who were researching Global South topics, or indeed were from the Global South themselves, mentioned that we didn't have resources they needed. We didn't have some of the journals, we didn't have some of the grey literature they wanted to use in their systematic reviews. And if they didn't use these resources, they didn't have enough evidence for their systematic review. So we did have a look at our resources, we looked at the literature, we saw why a database is actually missing key evidence. And we actually had some quite interesting discoveries, which we've hopefully resolved. Of course, it's not completely possible to completely resolve these issues, but we've made progress. And one of the major ones is we didn't have a lot of open journal system journals within our search strategies, and we didn't index open access within OneSearch, which meant that by not indexing the open access, we were missing large amounts of evidence which would be used in Global South topics. Also, in some topics, it could be up to 60% of the evidence is within open journal systems or open access papers. So we can actually miss a lot of evidence. That was a relatively quick fix. So we have guidance and we encourage people to search through OGS databases as well as the open access within OneSearch. This is great as well because it's what we would call decolonising by default. All we're doing is we're integrating more decolonised resources into the places that everybody searches and increasing the quality of the evidence that they're looking for and the relevance of the resources. However, one of the other things a bit more tricky was the grey literature. A lot of the evidence we discovered that people wanted to use was in grey literature. It can be a bit of a barrier to publish in major journals for researchers from the Global South. Like you mentioned about criminality of certain topics, that could be an issue. Also, it's unlikely to be funded. Probably if it was even recently decriminalised, it's less likely maybe to find some funding to actually publish in journal articles. So therefore, it would be more likely to be published within the grey literature. And for this, we actually purchased two databases, Overton.io, Policy Comments. We've had those for a while now. They're fantastic because they contain grey literature, they contain NGO information, policy and guidance. Some of them quite localised evidence as well from certain groups, but some of them much more broader. And so you can find a lot of complementary evidence you might find quite useful for those. Would that have been something you would have found quite useful?
Yes, definitely. I mean, a lot of the policy documentation that I used for my research was both national and more local. So there were kind of these big national, well, even international. So I used a lot of stuff from the World Health Organization because they have their own statistics and diagnostics manual called the International Classification of Diseases. So a lot of the policy documentation that went into that, which removed homosexuality in 1991, I believe, So I used that, but I also used local hospital-based policy documentation, education policy that was used in university settings to educate people from the medical profession, but also, like you were saying, NGOs. One of the key resources that I used was a report called Less Than Gay, a citizen's report on the status of homosexuality in India, and that kind of contained medical, legal, cultural and religious policy recommendations almost that were there to kind of like push forward for the human rights to be applied to people with queerness and to decriminalise it within India.
That's really good. And hopefully that would be a policy which we would now index within one search. It would show up in a search. We'd also be encouraging people to search these additional grey literature databases. And the aim would be, I like to use the word decolonising by default. So in reality, these resources are just included within a normal search strategy. Undergrads will be searching them through our one search database, and then they'll be using them in search strategies when they become postgrads, and then just keep on going until our academics are all using these decolonising resources, and we'll feel the loss of them when they are not there.
Yes.
Therefore, the research process is much more decolonised in nature. I think that's really important. That's fantastic. What kind of resources for you were really, really important? What kind of things did you say were fantastic use?
So for me, a lot of it was the kind of queer-created, queer-centred stuff. So a lot of magazine articles, filmic representations, blog articles as well, which are obviously online, but they were siloed in their own kind of like specific websites that you had to know about the networks that existed in order to access them. And there were some like queer databases put together by Indian NGOs and activists that I could access, but it was this, because policy documents are very interesting from an institutional perspective, but when you come in from somewhere where you want to kind of centre queer voices, you want those queer voices. So the magazines and the kind of personal archive material was really, really important to my research.
You mentioned, you have mentioned a lot about journals.
Yeah.
So did you use a lot of journals for your research?
Yes, so I did a massive sweep of all Indian psychiatric and psychological journals that existed from 1945 to 2020. Yes, there was a lot of them, and they have slight variations. You've got like the Indian Journal of Psychiatry and then Indian Journal of Psychology and then Psychological Medicine. So they have these very kind of like close names, and then having to search their databases for the terms that I was using, some of which are, were older medicalised terms that we used. So there was a lot of journal articles, to be honest, and I also at one point was comparing them with stuff from the British Medical Journal and the Lancet to see if there was an international link in thought between different places. So a lot of journals, mainly medical.
It sounds very much like you could have done a systematic literature review.
Yes. Would
have been quite useful. And that leads us nicely into that last resource we're mentioning. And that is LGBTQ plus thoughts. And this is one of our newer resources we'd like to introduce to everybody.
Yes.
If you're not using it already, we've had it about a year. It's been used for quite a few reviews at Lancaster. And this is essentially a literature database, very similar to Medline or Academic Search Ultimate. In fact, it's from the same company, EBSCO. But it has some real benefits if you want to do a formal literature search on LGBTQ plus topics. One of its major benefits is it's got an inbuilt dictionary. It's called a thesaurus or dictionary or subject term list.
Yeah.
This means that it's actually got a list of different terminology that you can select from to add to a search. What you want to do is what's called a highly sensitive search, and that's a search which retrieves as much of the evidence as possible. Yes, it's going to retrieve some irrelevant papers, possibly, but you can screen those out.
Yeah.
The aim will be to remove from screening, not by doing a brilliant search. However, you want to make sure you've got all of the papers. And like you mentioned, if language has changed,
yes,
inappropriate terminology has been used in the past, and the up-to-date language might not capture all of the evidence. Sometimes they do campaigns where they retrospectively tag papers with old or out-of-date terminology. But it is always going to happen. So one of the things is you can use this for searching for topics which might have changed over time. And you gave me a really good example. What was it again?
It was hermaphrodite or hermaphroditism.
Okay, super. So we could have chosen one we could say easier.
We could have.
But it's a really good example. So that's really interesting because that's a term which has changed.
Yes.
So can you explain to me a little about the change in the terminology over time?
Yeah, so the issue with hermaphrodite, other than the fact that it has been used as a slur for members of both the intersex community and the broader LGBTQ community as well, is the fact that it became quite a generalised term, especially in kind of like the colonial era. I mean, Foucault, when he's talking about sexuality, talks about queerness being viewed as the hermaphroditism of the soul, and that shows in a lot of the medical papers where they kind of conflate sexual orientation with gender identity. And then when you add into India on top of that, you have a different sex-gender system. So obviously they have the third sex, which is actually protected by law. And there's kind of like members of the Hijra community that are third gender, which would not consider themselves to be intersex, but some of them are. So terms like hermaphrodite become very loaded because they become generalised to the point where you're not actually sure what category, and I use that with scare quotes, of people that you're dealing with. So it flattens out the experience and becomes really problematic as a term when you're thinking about histories of sexuality and orientation.
Yes, and that's really interesting as well when you bring it into context of a literature search, there's differences in people able to perceive the concept.
Yes.
It's written differently, it's researched differently.
Yes.
So if you're just searching, for instance, one term, hermaphrodism, you might miss a lot of the other evidence.
Yes.
And the aim would be to do a search which searches all of the different words automatically, even ones you don't necessarily know, and bring them into your search and screen them out. And having a look at our database for that term would be used within LGBTQ plus source, and the subject term would be intersexuality.
Yes.
And that would be the term you would select. But if you select intersexuality, you will also search for the terms bisexual biology, hermaphroditism, intersex conditions, and pseudo-hermaphroditism. Can you say that for me as well?
No.
Oh, sorry. So it would include all of those. And so you'd select them in your search. And what you'd also do is search through the title and abstract for any of the words, even slang terms you would include in there, because slang terms can often be used in grey literature. LGBTQ plus source does include grey literature, newspapers, as well as journals. So you're including the grey literature where there'll be a lot of LGBTQ plus evidence into a highly sensitive search used as in a systematic review. And that can actually bring the quality of the research up. It can improve it with this really high quality search. And you don't worry about missing some of the evidence. And that's why I think it's absolutely fantastic. Again, it'll be linked. There'll be a link to LGBTQ plus source, so you can give it a go. You can also book in a session with your faculty librarians where we'll show you how to do one of these highly sensitive searches to search through all of the evidence and how to combine them with other databases like Medline or Academic Search Ultimate. So I think we'll draw to a close. I've done my advertising. I have heard about your absolutely fantastic research. I was really, really interested. And it's been absolutely a delight having you. So I'd just like to say thank you for telling us all about your research.
Thank you for having me so much. And I hope everybody has a happy Pride.
And I do too.